Episode 1. Brian Davis, True Geordie, King of the North. So he got to the end of school and he sat there with the guidance counsellor, not really knowing what he wants to do, not knowing which direction his life's going to go in. His mates were all getting apprenticeships, so he goes and gets an apprenticeship at an engineering firm, and within a couple of years he decides, no, not for me. So after a while he goes back to college and studies English, sociology and psychology, not necessarily subjects you'd associate with True Geordie, but he does. And then after a while he has a look on YouTube and he thinks, I could be a YouTuber, but I don't think there's much money in it. Is there any money in it? Can I make money in it? But the video he looks at is one of deep sea diving, and he knows that there is definitely money in that. Lots and lots of money. In the past he thought he'd maybe follow his dad's footsteps as a bodybuilding route, powerlifting route, and he even interviewed Eddie Hall, as we'll get onto later, but that route, it never materialised. So deep sea diving it was, and deep sea diving was a thing that started his career. That was his livelihood, and he made some great memories doing it. It was living their life. Girls, money, girls, money, girls, money. And then there was a death in the family. Everything stopped. Everything. I know this from personal experience. 18 months ago, 24 months ago, 2 years roughly, my dad died, and yeah, everything stops completely. And you start to refocus, and you start to think where your priorities really lie and what you really want to spend doing for the rest of your life. And I feel that this is what happened to Brian during this period. Soon after the death of a close family member, George, one of his closest friends, died as well. George was a massive Newcastle fan, a far bigger fan than Brian, despite all his love and his passion for Newcastle, will ever be. He lived and breathed Newcastle, and this was the start of True Geordie, or Football Fan 533. Not long after George's funeral, Nile Ranger came out and started slating the fans. Now, Nile Ranger, for those who don't know, is a footballer who has been arrested more times than he's probably scored goals in his career. But he basically came out and started slating the fans for booing and basically having an opinion on his poor performances and the team's poor performances as a whole. Now, Brian said a few times at this point in his life he was probably, looking back, suffering from depression, and he wasn't going to accept that. Nile Ranger insulted, he felt, George and his family and everything that he stood for as a person. So he fired up the laptop and gave him a piece of his mind.
Right, a message to Nile Ranger here. Newcastle United player. I say player, I use that term loosely. Pond life would probably be a better fucking term for the little cunt. A player who very, very rarely plays for the Newcastle team has come out and criticised the fans.
From the outside, without knowing the context of the situation, it looks like a northern guy, a Newcastle fan that's had far too many pints who's raging at a video. But if you look deeper, you know the true meaning behind this. You know this comes from a real true and a real deep place in Brian's heart. And I think that's the reason why it started to go viral. Within 1 hour, 20,000 views, and Brian privated the video. Not long after, gets a call from one of his deep sea diving mates, basically saying, "You're speaking the truth, everything you're saying is the truth, put the video back up." At this point it was called Football Fan 533. The name True Geordie became a thing because the title of the video was A True Geordie's View on Nile Ranger. And from that moment, True Geordie was born. Some people thought it was a bit like Marmite at this stage. Because of the swearing, the loud and the aggressive nature, people thought he's just a nutter, he's a loudmouth that doesn't know much, but it soon became clear that he was very knowledgeable and he was a very clever guy, and he used this to his advantage. It was different, there was something different about him. He had a unique selling point from the business mould. He wasn't just a normal vlogger standing there with his camera. It was different, it was unique, and it was marketable. Talking of marketable, that's a word that is very, very specific to the Football Republic, who Brian went on to work with in the coming weeks and months after this initial video, and when he decided to do YouTube full time. During this time, he said there were some very hard days where he sometimes thought, can I even pay the rent? Can I afford to eat? But he kept going, he backed himself into a corner, and he came out fighting. On the Football Republic, it was working with people like Andy Tate, the Man United fan who was so well known for saying, give it gigs until the end of the season, and also Jimmy Conrad and Lawrence McKenna. Now, the impact of Lawrence McKenna was not yet known, but he played a huge role in who True Geordie is today. He became well known for his outbursts at Newcastle United and Mike Ashley, slating the team whenever there was a bad performance, and people flocked to watch it, for the similar reason as they do to go and watch Arsenal Fan TV. As soon as Arsenal lose, people flock to Arsenal Fan TV, and that channel gets millions of views after a loss. Brian was onto something here, he was onto something good, but he didn't want to just be known as the guy who rages, or the loudmouth, or the idiot who rages about football and shouts his head off. He wanted to do what he wanted to do. He wanted to showcase his talent, his knowledge, and his experience. After a while at the Football Republic, things turned sour. Basically, Brian thought it was better than the Football Republic. They were bringing him down to their level, and he was correct. It was true. So him and Lawrence McKenna moved away and started their own podcast. During this time, the people who worked at the Football Republic said True Geordie, or Brian, was not marketable. Because of his swearing and the profanities he used in his videos, it was not marketable, no brand would touch him. Yep, that went well.
It's me new gaff, do you like it? It's mint, isn't it?
How the hell have you got to this place?
I've just signed a deal with Coral. Did I tell you? I've never seen so many zeros.
He's also mentioned in a few podcasts and other videos that there's been little support from Newcastle, so it wasn't just the Football Republic. But the Football Republic definitely did say he wasn't marketable, which Coral and Ladbrokes have had something to say about. Then not long after, Brian got his first big break in YouTube. Spencer Owen, or Spencer FC, gave him the role of commentating on the Wembley Cup against the Sidemen. This was True Geordie's real big break. It exposed him to a far wider audience given the numbers that were actually watching this football match. And given his experience and him commentating over the football and his grand saying, do you know what, Brian? You should be a commentator. It was in his element, he loved it. And although it was his first time, he excelled. So much so that KSI, or JJ, actually praised him after. Now there is no higher praise from a YouTuber. He's the king of UK YouTube.
Through, it's on the right hand side, he's going to cut it over the top. Oh, what a finish, my son!
As I've mentioned, Brian and Lawrence moved away from the Football Republic to start their own podcast. Now again, Brian had critics, people saying you can't upload a full-length podcast to YouTube, nobody's going to watch it. But they did, and within a couple of episodes, some videos reached around the 1 million view mark. To help with the views, along came YouTubers, and they came in their droves. Spencer Owen, Joe Weller, and then later KSI. Also, I can't go without mentioning that he uploaded a podcast on Christmas Day for the people that were alone or didn't have anyone to spend Christmas Day with, especially for them. This just shows what type of guy that Brian is, to think about other people in such a way. Now, on Christmas Day, it's not an ideal time to get views. People aren't going to be watching YouTube, they're going to be spending the day with their families and friends. But he uploaded a podcast for those people that were alone, and so they felt that they had company on Christmas Day. Now, Brian was very honest. He said that he himself had been in this position where he was actually alone on Christmas Day. He mentioned that in a podcast, so it was absolutely fantastic for him to do this. And I think that helped him gain even more respect in the community. From me anyway. It was a fantastic thing to do, and I'm sure it was appreciated by a number of people. Now, I'm not sure how I've got this far without mentioning Joe Rogan. True Geordie's idol. He idolises that guy. He's mentioned before how when he played games or when he did anything, he always had the Joe Rogan podcast on in the background. And you've heard the saying, train until your idols become rivals. That was happening with True Geordie. This was closely followed by the birth of Bribry. This was linked in with a dig at vloggers and especially Alfie Days. Now Alfie Days, or Pointless Blog as he's known on YouTube, has got millions of subscribers, and he basically daily vlogs his life, does videos about his life, and he portrays the image, so Brian said, of a perfect life. And Brian, being the True Geordie or the realest guy on YouTube, as many people have said, he wasn't having it. He felt that Alfie was portraying that life was full of roses and his life was perfect, and I don't think he thought that was good for people's mental health. And as some people say with Instagram, people portraying a perfect life, and Alfie wasn't living a perfect life. Nobody lives a perfect life, and he called him out on it, and as I've said, it was the birth of Bribry. The Bribry video was closely followed by a number of good podcasts. Paul Hannaford, Sean Atwood, and Dr. Tijan Esho, who actually said in one of his podcasts that he has worked cosmetically on a member of the royal family. Obviously he didn't say who, but that is a fantastic podcast and a really interesting one. Sean went on to appear 3 times on the podcast, and counting, but during these appearances he had a number of fighters on his podcast. He had Chris Eubank, Frank Mir and Dan Hardy. Now Frank Mir and Dan Hardy are UFC fighters, or well, past UFC fighters. They no longer compete, and Chris Eubank is an ex-boxer, one of the best in the business. This is again going back to Joe Rogan. He idolised Joe Rogan. Now, I'm sure many of you know, but he actually commentates on the UFC. It was clear from these podcasts that Brian had a real interest in fighting, a real passion for it, and that would pay real dividends as time went on. And then there was the moment that everything changed. Alfie Days, or Pointless Blog, went on the True Geordie podcast. This was something monumental. Nobody thought this would ever happen. He'd been going at this guy again and again and again, and he'd agreed to be on his podcast, so fair play to Alfie for doing that. And this video did so many views, and it really exposed him to a completely different audience. Now, I'm not saying a lot of Alfie's audience would go and watch True Geordie, because Alfie's audience is primarily young girls, but it certainly opened him up to a completely new demographic that had not experienced his content ever before. This was closely followed by a podcast with the world's strongest man. Now at this point, Brian was getting real big names on his podcast. It built it up over around a year at this point, to the point where it was attracting big names, and big names were wanting to come to him rather than him going to them. He'd been trying to sort the Eddie Hall podcast for a long time, and he'd finally done it, and we finally got somebody that made Brian look small. Then there was a bit of a disagreement between Theo Baker and Joe Weller. Now Theo Baker had basically had his career started by a lifelong friend in Joe Weller, so how else did they sort it out? With a YouTube boxing match. Now the content was filmed, they had big breaks in between the rounds, and Joe sent the footage over to Brian and he commentated on his iPhone. From Brian's thoughts and podcasts, I don't think he was particularly proud of the commentating that he did. He didn't think it was fantastic. So after Joe Weller won, he decided to call somebody out, and KSI thought, yeah, I'll have a go at this YouTube boxing match. It was quite a friendly thing. There wasn't really any animosity involved because KSI had started Joe Weller's career. Joe Weller uploaded a video, How to be KSI, and KSI liked it or retweeted it, shared it basically, and that was the birth of Joe Weller. But at the upload event, where YouTubers all go and fans go and do meet and greets and they sell merchandise, they had a face-off, and True Geordie was the moderator. KSI mentioned something to do with mental health, which Joe struggled with in the past, and has been a real big advocate for, and it all kicked off and it got real serious, and KSI went from taking it as a bit of a joke to game time. Now, while we were waiting for the fight in February, Brian's career changed. He'd finally got a sponsor. Now, he'd had a couple of little sponsorships in the past, one for trimming beard hair that sponsored one of his podcasts, but this was big. This was next level. He'd made it. He'd been sponsored for the season by Coral. Now, Coral were basically wanting him to do a live stream where they'd watch the game, get guests on, him and Lawrence and other guests such as Joe Weller and other YouTube names such as Hugh Wizzy, who's been on numerous times, and Statman Dave, and watch the game, react to it, and because of how entertaining they all are, it was guaranteed to be a success. It was around this time that Brian started to meet Will N.E., and I think he helped him get into his head about the YouTube game, titles, thumbnails, and all that sort of thing, because Brian was uploading really good content, but it wasn't necessarily getting the views that go along with that because of how he was titling the videos and tags and other things, and I think Will taught him quite a lot during this period and helped him with the growth of his channel. As a part of the Coral sponsorship, him and Lawrence also had to upload Premier League predictions and predict the weekend's games, and let's be honest, he seemed to hate doing that. He's now doing that with a different sponsor, which I will come on to, which seems a lot better, but he seemed to hate the format of doing that. But the live streams were absolutely fantastic, and hundreds of thousands of people tuned in to watch these every single week. He also did live streams for boxing and other big UFC events, McGregor versus Mayweather, and these went down fantastically well, with some even getting 15 million views, such as the McGregor fight. Now, that is probably due to how he titled it, as it was something like McGregor versus Mayweather Live, which people would have been searching for an illegal stream, I guess. But nevertheless, they all do fantastic views, and it was a real big bold move by Coral to go and sponsor somebody that was unmarketable. Now, in between the upload event and the actual boxing match in February, True Geordie probably got his main guest on the True Geordie podcast. Alan Shearer, the guy he had idolised from a very young age, the guy he'd watched on telly and commentated over, was finally on his podcast. Now, Brian had actually met Alan at a corporate event, and I'm not sure how far this went to getting him on the podcast, but he'd definitely seen his videos at this point, and he was finally on the True Geordie podcast. Alan was remarkably honest, and Brian got some fantastic answers out of him, especially regarding Gary Speed and other certain situations during his football career. I'm sure he was unbelievably nervous for this interview. It's basically, so if you imagine your hero or somebody you idolise or you idolise as a child, going and interviewing them for 2 hours, that must be incredibly difficult to get some good answers out of him, and he did really well. Now, he was very critical of himself and thought he could have done this and that, but if you imagine how difficult that must be to someone you've always looked up to, I think he did a fantastic job. Not long after this podcast, Brian was on the train from London back to Newcastle when he got an email proposing to be from Robbie Williams, or Robbie Williams' agent. He wanted to appear on the True Geordie podcast, and he said he was a massive fan. Now, I think if anybody got this email, they'll think this is a load of rubbish, but it went through and he had a look, and it was a real thing. It was Robbie Williams. He was a huge fan of the show, and he's watched every single podcast. So Brian and Lawrence went to Robbie's house, got food made by the in-house chef, and it was a fantastic podcast to listen to. I think it was around 3 hours long, and I'm sure they'll do another one very soon, but that is unbelievable. Now, this was a really important podcast. Again, it helped him open up to a completely new demographic, and it showed how far he'd come from the guy that used to rage and shout and bawl and scream about Newcastle United, especially when they'd been relegated. He was now a fantastic podcaster, a great commentator, and he was really moving up in the YouTube game. And then it was time for KSI versus Joe Weller, and by now there was a great deal of animosity. These two seemed to genuinely not even dislike but hate each other. Now, it was clear for all to see that Brian actually favoured Joe Weller and is close to Joe Weller. KSI even said that Joe Weller is the realest guy on YouTube when he appeared in a True Geordie podcast, and I think True Geordie and Joe Weller are very similar. They're very honest people. I think that's why they bounce off each other. He did a podcast with both fighters before, and they were really different. KSI was so over the top and arrogant and cocky, and Joe Weller was more reserved in his shell. True Geordie had been chosen as commentator, and he was absolutely in his element. Although it was difficult for him with Joe fighting, he loved it, and it was what he was meant to do. Now, the fight didn't go Joe's way. KSI won quite comfortably, and a lot of people criticised True Geordie, especially KSI fans, a number of fans that he's got, for being biased towards Joe Weller during the fight. Now, having watched the fight back, there was definitely an element of bias, which Brian's already admitted, but if you think how difficult that must be to commentate on when it's one of your close friends, it's not really surprising. One really important thing that Brian did after the fight, during all the criticism that he received from fans, especially on Twitter, he owned those mistakes. He knew he'd made certain mistakes, given the bias, but he owned them. He explained why, and he vowed to improve in the future. And then, in January 2018, Logan Paul, an American vlogger, YouTube personality, made a video in a suicide forest. This was quickly taken down by YouTube, but as soon as the mainstream media got hold of it, it was going viral and it was going everywhere. It wasn't long before everybody knew about it, and everybody knew, even if they didn't already, everybody knew who Logan Paul was. So Brian had woken up, I think it was quite early, and he'd seen what Logan Paul had done, and this really touched a nerve. Brian explained how once he'd found a friend that had committed suicide, he'd found somebody like that. It was a real touching message, and the views didn't really matter. At the time it was his most viewed video, but that wasn't of any importance. The message that he got across about mental health and the number of young people he'd got messaging him during his time on YouTube about mental health issues and similar things like that, you could see that it came from a real good place. It wasn't doing it like many YouTubers did, just for the views. It came from a good place, and it was a fantastic video. Seeing somebody that's 6'4" and 23-24 stone crying on video is quite a humbling experience, and it really showed the true measure of the man, that it was comfortable to do that, and he really was true, as his name suggests. As I've mentioned, the views, I'm sure, didn't matter to Brian, but it's hard to ignore that this video did actually do over 3 million views, and again, it will have opened him up to another audience entirely. It was around this time that his videos started to improve dramatically. I'm not sure whether that was the influence of Lawrence and his director past, but his video quality really started to improve, and the views didn't necessarily come along with that, but it was only a matter of time. The documentary he did on firstly Conor McGregor and then Kanye West were fantastic. They were real good pieces of work that would have graced any cinema or any TV screen. Now, after the KSI fight, he said, "Is there anybody you want to call out?" And he called out Logan Paul or Jake Paul, and to cut a long story short, he ended up fighting Logan Paul. So when it came to the press conferences, Brian vowed to do a better job than Shannon Briggs did in the US press conference. But when it got to it, it was a shit show.
Can we stop throwing shit, because everyone's going to go home?
Brian will be the first one to admit that he had completely lost control, and I don't think anybody would have kept control. Deji or Comedy Shorts Gamer was shouting boring, and KSI was going off on one on Logan Paul, and after 5 or 6 minutes, Logan Paul put the mic down and he just left. Brian again came in for some huge criticism during this point, but yet again, he owned his mistakes. He knew he'd made a mistake.
Definitely let that go a little too long. Definitely.
But I don't think even he could have expected what was to come. A few days later, Logan Paul made a video slating True Geordie. He called him the moderator and said he was a hater. And after his video, I guess you could say that, but he didn't hate Logan Paul's videos, he just hated what Logan Paul had done and what he seemed to stand for after that incident. Logan Paul and KSI had to actually agree on everything during the fight, and all the stage and numbers of people, price, everything, and the commentator was one thing that they could not agree on. True Geordie was wanted by KSI, but Logan Paul did not want a hater, as he described him as, commentating on his boxing match. So effectively at this point, Brian had been removed from his dream job. It would have been in his element, a fight fan, a commentator. It was going to be Joe Rogan, and it had all been taken away from him by Logan Paul. What followed was astounding. People were setting up petitions. 15,000 people signed a petition for him to be commentator. Cal Freezy was one of the big advocates of True Geordie, saying he has to commentate, we need him to commentate. KSI, I think, even tweeted saying it's not up to him, he wants True Geordie to commentate, but both sides had to agree. And then, a few days later, something shocking happened. True Geordie received a call from Logan Paul. Now at this point, Brian was being told by his friends and all the YouTube stars to make sure whatever you do, record this phone call, because Logan Paul could twist this in a certain way and twist his words to make him look better and make True Geordie look terrible, and given the influence of Logan Paul, potentially kill his career completely. So Brian did record the phone call, but nothing dodgy happened. They sorted it out like men, they spoke about the differences.
To get information across to each other. That's why I just wanted to call you and let you know where I was coming from and how I feel.
And True Geordie was reinstated in his dream job. It was around this time that True Geordie was roughly 750,000 subscribers, and then after all this Logan Paul controversy, he hit 1 million, and then 1.1 million, and then 1.2 million. And soon enough, it was at 1.3 million subscribers within what seemed like a week or a couple of weeks. I'm sure True Geordie didn't want to hit the 1 million subscriber mark while he was in limbo about maybe losing his dream job, but that's what happened, and as it is, it all worked out in his favour. At this point, he was raking it in. All he had to do was put Logan Paul in the title, and it didn't matter what his video quality was. But do you know what? He didn't slack. The videos were fantastic, the production quality, fantastic. True Geordie kept up his standards when it would have been easy to slack. Before the fight, he also interviewed Logan Paul, Jake Paul and KSI. These podcasts were unbelievable, fantastic. Nobody had seen Logan Paul and Jake Paul in this light. The interviews and the questions that he asked were really well worded and got some real good, insightful answers from the two brothers. And he came out with a lot of credit from these podcasts, even from Logan Paul's girlfriend, which is mentioned in a recent podcast, Chloe Bennett, even saying he's a fantastic interviewer and he can go far. And if he's getting that sort of praise from such big people, then he's onto a winner. So then came fight night, and he was in his element. Joe Weller on one side, Lawrence McKenna, who we'd met all those years ago on the Football Republic, on the other side. Almost 1 million people bought the pay-per-view, and unfortunately around 700,000 or whatever it was watched on Twitch. Now on this fight, the bias, what was evident in the last fight between KSI and Joe Weller, it wasn't there. He was truly honest. He called it as he saw it. Now he said, after the fight, he got in the ring with KSI to interview him, and for the first time ever, he was speechless. He didn't know what to say. The lights came in. Everyone seemed to be looking at him, and he didn't know what to say. But he rode it out well, and I don't think, if he hadn't mentioned it, many people would have even realised. But that's what the man does. He owns his mistakes. He owns his own faults, and that is why he's gone so far. He is true to himself, and he's true to his subscribers. Now after the whole KSI Logan Paul boxing match, he did a number of videos with Logan Paul and KSI in the title, and who can blame him? He said he wants to drive an R8 or a Ferrari. Now I think he currently drives a 3-litre BMW, which is not bad in itself, but with those videos that he uploaded after, they were doing 3 million, almost 4 million views every single video, so I'm sure he's a little bit closer to the R8 or Ferrari now. Now his views are steadily increasing, but as I've mentioned before, he's not one of these YouTubers that clickbaits and goes with the trends. His videos are top quality, the true, honest opinions, and personally, I think his content is arguably up there with the best on YouTube. I'd just like to end this by saying that Brian really helped me through a tough time. When my dad died, I listened to every single podcast once, maybe twice, especially when I went to sleep, to help get rid of those bad thoughts that obviously came into my head during that time, and I can't really thank him enough for that. It did wonders for me. So the same way that Joe Rogan helped True Geordie during that tough time, Brian also helped me in a very similar way, and it'd be fantastic if he could see this, so please comment, tag him in it, whatever you can do, and yeah, I hope you've enjoyed.